Welcome to this deep dive into a decade that, well, continues to fascinate and challenge us, the 1960s in America.
It really does.
We've gathered a range of sources to explore this transformative period, one that conjures up images of both remarkable progress and profound turmoil.
Yeah.
Think civil rights marches alongside the escalation in Vietnam. It's a real paradox of hope and struggle.
That's right. Your sources really highlight this inherent tension. It wasn't a simple narrative of progress, It was complex, often contradictory.
Right.
Our goal here is to move beyond just recounting events and really extract the core insights into the political earthquakes, the social revolutions, the cultural shifts, everything that defined this pivotal time.
Okay, let's get right to it then. The decade opened with a fiercely contested presidential election, 1960, Nixon and Kennedy.
Right. It's very close.
Both were talking about moving America forward, particularly on the economy. But what were the sort of fundamental differences in their approaches? How did that set the stage?
Well, what's fascinating here is it wasn't just about economic policies, though that was key. Kennedy, he advocated for federal intervention, to stimulate growth, address poverty.
Okay.
Nixon, on the other hand, championed private enterprise, less government spending. This really laid the groundwork for that fundamental ideological debate about the government's role, which carried on through the 60s, and frankly, you still hear echoes of it today.
And then came that first televised debate. It's hard to overstate how much of a turning point that was, wasn't it?
Absolutely. A huge turning point. Radio listeners, they thought it was pretty even.
Right.
But the visual impact on TV viewers,
Yeah.
it's decisive. Kennedy looked composed, confident. Nixon, he appeared less polished.
Sweating a bit, apparently.
Yeah, exactly. And this gave Kennedy a significant edge in public perception. It really showed the growing power of television and politics.
Definitely.
Yet, like you said, the election itself remained incredibly close.
Yeah.
It really spoke to how divided the country was.
A truly narrow victory. And even though he won the Electoral College, Kennedy didn't really have a strong mandate in Congress, did he? It sounds like that created immediate headwinds.
Exactly. That lack of a solid congressional majority meant Kennedy faced, considerable challenges getting his New Frontier proposals through.
Right.
And that was even before the major foreign policy crises hit, which happened pretty quickly. It just underscores a delicate balance in American politics. Winning the presidency doesn't guarantee legislative success.
Which brings us to Cuba, a huge issue early on. The early 60s saw this dramatic shift in U.S.-Cuban relations. Initially, the U.S. recognized Castro's government after the '59 revolution. So what triggered their rapid deterioration?
Well, initially there was a degree of maybe cautious acceptance. But as Castro's government brought in these significant leftist reforms, land redistribution, nationalizing American-owned businesses, the U.S. got increasingly wary. This economic shift led to a big wave of Cuban immigration to the U.S., and, consequently, the U.S. stance hardened pretty quickly.
Right, and that led to the U.S. imposing a trade embargo, eventually cutting off diplomatic ties altogether.
Yeah.
Then came the Bay of Pigs invasion.
Yeah.
Can you give us the sort of essential breakdown of that operation? What went wrong?
Well, the CIA was operating under this fundamentally flawed assumption that Castro just didn't have popular support.
Okay.
They thought there'd be a popular uprising. So they trained this force of Cuban exiles for an invasion.
Yeah.
April 61, they landed at the Bay of Pigs.
Yeah.
But they were met by a much stronger, much more prepared Cuban military.
Yeah.
The invasion was, a swift and complete failure.
A disaster.
A major humiliation for the Kennedy administration.
Yeah.
And ironically, it probably solidified Castro's grip on power.
A real foreign policy blunder. And it seems that failure might have emboldened Cuba and its Soviet allies, kind of setting the stage for the much more dangerous Cuban Missile Crisis later.
Absolutely. What's so striking about the Cuban Missile Crisis is how it brought the world literally to the brink of nuclear war. So, in 1962, the Soviet Union, partly responding to U.S. missiles in Turkey and invited by Cuba, started secretly putting their own nuclear missiles on the island.
And U.S. spy planes found them.
They did. U.S. reconnaissance flights discovered the sites in October. Kennedy then addressed the nation, went on TV, and for 13 incredibly tense days, the world just held its breath.
It must have been an unimaginable period of fear. How was such a, potentially catastrophic situation ultimately diffused?
Through intense, behind-the-scenes diplomatic negotiations. Really back-channel stuff.
Right.
The Soviet Union eventually agreed to remove its missiles from Cuba. In return, The U.S. privately agreed to take its missiles out of Turkey
Okay.
and publicly pledged not to invade Cuba. It was delicate, precarious, but it worked. It averted a global catastrophe.
Wow.
And perhaps it forced both superpowers to really confront the terrifying reality of nuclear annihilation, maybe leading to better communication channels like the hotline.
Even after the crisis calmed down, the story of Cuban immigration didn't stop, did it? It continued in the mid-60s.
Yes, that's right. In 1965, the Johnson administration negotiated an agreement with Cuba. This was to allow families who'd been separated by earlier migrations to reunite.
Ah, great.
And this opened the door for another significant wave of Cuban immigration. Then you had the Cuban Adjustment Act in 1966.
What did that do?
It basically offered Cuban refugees a pathway to permanent residency in the U.S. And that really shaped the demographics of communities in Florida and elsewhere.
Okay, shifting focus now domestically to what many consider the defining movement of the decade, the civil rights struggle.
Absolutely central.
Our sources really emphasize its growing intensity and the emergence of this new wave of student activism demanding immediate change.
Exactly. While the legal battles against school segregation in the 50s, like Brown v. Board, were crucial,
Yeah.
the 1960s saw this surge of direct action, particularly from young people. They just weren't willing to wait for gradual change anymore.
Impatient.
Yes, and they embraced more confrontational, though still nonviolent, tactics to challenge that deeply entrenched segregation in the South.
The Greensboro sit-ins in 1960 are often cited as a spark for this new energy. What made them so significant?
Their significance, I think, lay in their simplicity, but also their profound impact. You had 4 African-American college students just sit down at a whites-only lunch counter at Woolworth's.
All right.
They politely asked for service, and when they were denied, they refused to leave.
Yeah.
This courageous act of nonviolent defiance repeated day after day.
Must have taken incredible bravery.
Oh, absolutely. It sparked a wave of similar sit-ins all across the South. It directly challenged segregation in public places and ultimately led Woolworths to desegregate its lunch counters. It just showed the power of grassroots activism.
And from this burgeoning movement arose SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
Yes, SNCC.
Ella Baker's role in its formation, emphasizing this decentralized grassroots power, seems particularly important.
Absolutely crucial. Baker, she was a veteran organizer. She saw the need for a student-led group that empowered young people for direct action. She was critical of more top-down leadership styles and really fostered SNCC as a vehicle for direct grassroots organizing. This enabled students like, John Lewis, Diane Nash, Stokely Carmichael to become key leaders,
Pushing for change.
pushing hard for more immediate fundamental change. Initially committed to nonviolence, SNCC would evolve later, reflecting that growing frustration.
Then came the Freedom Rides in 1961. This was directly testing the Supreme Court's rulings on integrated interstate travel.
Exactly. Testing those rulings.
And these met with just brutal resistance, especially in Alabama.
The Freedom Rides were incredibly bold. A deliberate challenge to the segregation that persisted on interstate buses and trains in the Deep South, despite court rulings.
Yeah.
Interracial groups of activists rode together, and they faced intense violence from white mobs, particularly in Alabama. Buses were firebombed near Anniston.
Horrific.
Riders were brutally beaten in Birmingham and Montgomery. But despite this awful violence, the Freedom Rides drew national, even international, attention to segregation.
It forced the issue.
It did. It ultimately compelled the Interstate Commerce Commission to finally enforce the Supreme Court's rulings on integrated interstate travel.
The Albany movement, in the fall of '61, that presented a different kind of challenge, didn't it? Especially with Police Chief Lori Pritchett's strategy.
Yeah, Albany, Georgia was a real stronghold of segregation. The Albany movement was this unified effort by various civil rights groups to desegregate the city.
Okay.
But Police Chief Pritchett, he adopted this unexpected strategy. Mass arrests, yes, but without resorting to, public brutality that would look bad on TV. He even arranged bail for prominent leaders like King to get them out quickly. This shrewd tactic kind of deprived the movement of those dramatic confrontations that had garnered sympathy elsewhere.
So it stalled the movement locally.
It did, largely. It was a valuable, if frustrating, learning experience for organizers about the complexities of resistance and different police tactics.
Our sources also highlight the deeply significant role of Black Christianity in the movement. It wasn't just moral guidance, was it?
Oh, much more than that. Black churches were vital organizing centers, absolutely essential hubs.
Right.
You had the deeply ingrained Christian commitment to justice, the powerful tradition of gospel music and hymns that provided spiritual strength.
Uplifting people.
Exactly. And the moral authority of preachers like Martin Luther King Jr., all this played a crucial role in framing segregation as a profound moral wrong and bolstering the courage of activists.
As the movement gained momentum, though, the resistance from white segregationists often turned violent. James Meredith, trying to integrate Ole Miss in '62, sparked deadly riots.
Yes, James Meredith's enrollment at the University of Mississippi was met with fierce, deadly rioting on campus. It's often called the Battle of Ole Miss.
Right.
President Kennedy had to deploy federal marshals, even the National Guard, to restore order and ensure Meredith's safety. The violence just underscored the deep-seated, often violent opposition to integration, especially in Southern universities.
Then comes 1963, a year just packed with pivotal events. You got the Birmingham campaign with those stark images, nonviolent protesters facing brutal police tactics.
Birmingham was huge. Organized by the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, it used direct action boycotts, sit-ins, marches to challenge segregation in Birmingham, Alabama, which was known as one of the most segregated cities.
And King was jailed there.
He was. And during that time, he wrote his powerful letter from Birmingham jail, really articulating the moral imperative for nonviolent direct action. The shocking images, police using fire hoses, attacked dogs against unarmed protesters, even children.
It was brutal.
Horrified the nation, galvanized public support for civil rights legislation. And ultimately, it led to an agreement to desegregate public accommodations in Birmingham.
But at the same time, you see the rise of figures like George Wallace in Alabama, a powerful symbol of that conservative resistance.
Definitely.
His segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever speech. It's chilling.
Wallace became this very vocal, influential figurehead for those vehemently opposed to the civil rights movement. That defiant inaugural address, and then his symbolic stand in the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama in June '63.
Trying to block black students.
Right. It brought him national notoriety as this staunch defender of segregation.
Tragically, the very day after Wallace's stand, Medgar Evers, the NBLE ACP field secretary, was assassinated in Mississippi.
Yeah, a terrible blow.
It felt like the nation was just reaching a boiling point, and all this culminated in the March on Washington in August '63.
The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom was a truly historic event. Hundreds of thousands of Americans, all races, gathered in D.C.
What were the key demands?
Comprehensive civil rights legislation,
Right.
equal job opportunities, an end to segregation in schools, a higher minimum wage, really broad demands for equality.
And of course, King's I Have a Dream speech.
An absolutely iconic moment, powerfully articulating the aspirations of the movement. It really intensified the pressure on politicians to act.
Kennedy had voiced support for a civil rights bill, but it was facing a serious opposition in Congress, right?
It was stalled, facing strong resistance, especially from Southern Democrats in his own party.
And then the country was just stunned by his assassination in November 1963.
Profound national tragedy. But Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, a Texan, crucially, with this deep understanding of how Congress worked.
A master legislator, they said.
Exactly, and apparently a personal commitment to civil rights, despite his Southern roots. He stepped into the presidency determined to see Kennedy's vision through.
And Johnson really did seize the moment, didn't he? Successfully pushing through the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Our sources stress how monumental this was.
Absolutely monumental. Johnson skillfully built bipartisan support, used his considerable political leverage. He knew how to twist arms to navigate that bill through a resistant Congress. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a landmark. It outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in public accommodations, employment, federally funded programs.
A huge blow to legal segregation.
A major blow to de jure segregation. Yes, segregation enforced by law.
But the fight wasn't over. The summer of '64 saw the Freedom Summer Project in Mississippi met with intense violence, including the horrific murders of Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman.
Freedom Summer was this incredibly courageous effort to register African-American voters in Mississippi, a state with just a brutal history of voter suppression.
Right.
Despite the legal wins, that deep-seated racism and violence persisted. The murders of those 3 young civil rights workers, 2 white, 1 black, shocked the nation. It highlighted the extreme dangers faced by activists.
We also had the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party challenging the all-white Mississippi delegation at the Democratic National Convention that summer, Fannie Lou Hamer's testimony.
Unforgettable. The MFDP's challenge exposed the hypocrisy, really, of a Democratic Party claiming to represent everyone, while Southern state parties actively disenfranchise black citizens.
Yeah.
Fannie Lou Hamer's testimony is so powerful, so moving, talking about the violence she faced, just trying to register, asking, is this America?
Chilling question.
It had a profound impact, even though the MFDP didn't get full representation at that convention.
And finally, the Selma to Montgomery marches in 1965, leading directly to the Voting Rights Act. Bloody Sunday remains just a horrifying reminder of the violence.
Selma was critical. The marches were organized to protest the continued denial of voting rights in Alabama. That brutal attack on unarmed marchers by state troopers and local police on the Edmund Pettus Bridge,
Bloody Sunday.
televised, horrified the nation. It really galvanized public support for federal action.
It pushed Johnson.
It absolutely did. It led President Johnson to go before Congress and introduce the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which he signed into law that August. It outlawed discriminatory voting practices like literacy tests and provided federal oversight, effectively ended the Jim Crow era's voter suppression tactics.
It's just remarkable to consider the pace of change and the immense struggle in those few short years.
Intense years.
Okay, so this sets the stage for Lyndon Johnson's really ambitious vision for the Great Society. What were the fundamental goals here?
Johnson's Great Society, announced in '64, was incredibly ambitious. A far-reaching agenda aimed at eradicating poverty, ending racial injustice, and significantly enhancing the quality of life for all Americans.
All or
He envisioned a society where opportunity was genuinely available to everyone, regardless of background.
And the legislative output was just staggering, wasn't it? Beyond the huge civil rights laws, we saw the Immigration Act, Medicare, Medicaid, big federal investment in education.
The scope was remarkable. The Hart-Celler Act in '65 completely changed American immigration, abolishing those old national origins quotas.
Right.
Medicare provided health insurance for the elderly, Medicaid for low-income people. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act was this historic expansion of federal funding for public schools. Food stamps started too.
A key component was the war on poverty, aimed directly at, well, poverty. The idea of maximum feasible participation in the community action programs. That sounds innovative, but also controversial.
Very innovative and, yes, controversial.
Yeah.
The idea was to empower poor communities themselves to have a direct say in designing and running the programs meant to help them.
Giving them agency.
Exactly. A radical departure from the usual top-down government approach. However, Johnson himself apparently held a more conventional view, and these grassroots community groups sometimes clashed with established political structures, like city mayors. So it led to criticism from both sides, those who thought it was too radical, stirring things up, and those on the left who felt it wasn't truly empowering enough or funded adequately,
Right.
especially as Vietnam costs grew.
We also saw this wave of intense urban unrest after the passage of these landmark civil rights laws. Riots in Watts in '65, then Newark, Detroit in '67. Seems almost paradoxical, doesn't it?
It does seem paradoxical. But these riots, they were fueled by deep-seated frustrations. Persistent residential segregation, police brutality, racial profiling.
So the laws hadn't fixed lived reality yet.
Exactly. Legal equality didn't automatically translate into lived equality or economic opportunity. Many in these communities felt the promise of the Great Society wasn't reaching them. So these events were seen by some as a powerful critique of its limitations. And you had the phenomenon of white flight, white residents leaving cities for the suburbs, which often exacerbated the concentration of poverty and racial segregation in urban centers.
Despite the criticisms, the unrest, our sources point out that many Great Society programs have actually endured.
They have. And that longevity really speaks to their enduring impact and perhaps a perceived necessity. Programs like Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, now SNAP, Head Start, federal funding for arts and humanities.
Still around?
Still around. So significant parts of American society providing a safety net, shaping our cultural landscape, even though debates about their scale and effectiveness continue.
Now let's turn to the ever-present shadow of the Vietnam War, which increasingly dominated the latter half of the decade. What were the initial factors that drew the U.S. into this conflict way back?
Well, U.S. involvement in Vietnam really has its roots in the post-World War II era and the prevailing Cold War ideology containing communism.
The domino theory.
The domino theory, exactly. The idea that if one nation in Southeast Asia fell to communism, others would inevitably follow. After the communist victory in China in '49, the U.S. started providing significant financial support to France
Right.
in its effort to maintain control over its colonies in Indochina, including Vietnam.
But the French were decisively defeated at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. That led to the Geneva Accords and the temporary division of Vietnam. The U.S. then kind of stepped in to support the South.
Pretty much. The U.S. feared a communist victory in the nationwide unification elections that were supposed to happen under the Geneva Accords.
As they blocked them.
They actively worked to prevent them. Instead, they threw their support behind the creation of an independent South Vietnam under Ngo Dinh Diem. He was anti-communist, but also authoritarian and lacked broad popular support.
And despite a lot of U.S. aid, military advisors being sent over, Diem's government and the South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN, they struggled to contain the communist insurgency, the Viet Cong.
They really did. Diem's regime was plagued by corruption, internal opposition, particularly from Buddhists. The ARVN proved largely ineffective against the Viet Cong guerrillas.
Then Diem was assassinated in '63, more instability.
Right. His overthrow and assassination, carried out by South Vietnamese generals but with tacit U.S. approval, actually ushered in a period of even greater political chaos. It further undermined the South Vietnamese government's ability to fight.
And was the American public really aware of all this back then?
Interestingly, despite the growing American involvement advisors, money of the issue remained relatively low on the radar for most Americans in the early 60s.
That all changed dramatically with the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964. This seems like the key turning point towards large-scale American military intervention.
It really was the trigger for escalation. The events in the Gulf of Tonkin in August '64, involving alleged attacks on U.S. Navy destroyers, well, they remain a subject of historical debate about exactly what happened, especially the second alleged attack.
Right, controversial.
Very. But the Johnson administration used these incidents, reported as fact at the time, to secure the Gulf of Tonkin resolution from Congress.
And what did that resolution do?
It granted President Johnson incredibly broad authority to take military action in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. It effectively paved the way for the massive escalation of U.S. involvement.
And by 1965, U.S. Marines had landed in Da Nang, Vietnam, the beginning of the American Ground War.
That's it. The start of the major ground war.
And the conflict just rapidly escalated, becoming increasingly costly lives, resources.
Once U.S. ground troops were committed, the conflict became this protracted, increasingly brutal war, fighting both the Viet Cong insurgents in the south and the North Vietnamese Army regular forces.
And it wasn't a traditional war, was it? Hard to measure progress.
Exactly. Traditional metrics, like territory gained, were largely irrelevant in this kind of guerrilla warfare. The focus shifted controversially to body counts as a measure of progress.
Grim.
Very grim. By 1968, the number of American troops in Vietnam had swelled to over 500,000. Casualties were mounting. There was no clear end in sight. And this led to growing dissent and widespread protests back home.
The 1960s weren't just about politics and war, though. It was also this decade of profound cultural transformation and the rise of activism beyond just civil rights. The youth counterculture really took hold, didn't it, and started to influence the mainstream.
It really did. The counterculture represented this significant departure from the more buttoned-down social norms of the 1950s.
Yeah.
It permeated so many aspects of American life: music, fashion, attitudes towards sex, authority. Initially seen as kind of a fringe movement, hippies, and so on.
Right.
But many elements, emphasizing individualism, freedom of expression, eventually got incorporated into mainstream popular culture, even advertising. Think Volkswagen ads.
Right. We saw these radical shifts in fashion, shorter skirts, bright colors, the whole hippie look, and the exploration of psychedelic drugs like LSD.
Yeah, drugs were a big part for some. A belief in spiritual or consciousness-expanding experiences as a way to break free from societal stagnation, though that eventually led to a political backlash, too.
And events like the Summer of Love in '67, Woodstock in '69, they became these iconic symbols of that cultural upheaval.
They did. The counterculture embraced ideals of peace, love, personal liberation. And while maybe the more utopian visions bumped up against the harsh realities of Vietnam and social inequality,
Sure.
its emphasis on individual autonomy, more liberal social values, questioning traditional authority that had a lasting impact on American society. Rock and roll became dominant too.
Meanwhile, as the civil rights movement achieved those landmark legislative victories, there was also this growing sense of frustration, wasn't there? With the slow pace of real change, persistent inequalities, leading to more assertive movements like Black Power.
Absolutely. The Black Power movement gaining prominence through figures like Malcolm X initially and then Stokely Carmichael.
Right.
It reflected a growing impatience within the Black community, a demand for greater self-determination, economic empowerment, Black pride.
How did it differ from King's approach?
Well, Malcolm X's philosophy emphasized self-defense by any means necessary and black nationalism, which contrasted sharply with King's strict adherence to nonviolence and integration. Later, the Black Panther Party advocated for community control, armed self-defense against police brutality, and radical social change. It was a definite shift in tone and strategy.
Our sources detail the evolution of SNCC too and the rise of the Black Panther Party, highlighting their more confrontational tactics, but also their focus on community survival programs.
Yes. SNCC, under leaders like Stokely Carmichael, became increasingly critical of integration as the sole goal. They expelled white members at one point, embraced a more radical vision of black liberation, focusing on urban injustices.
And the Panthers?
The Black Panther Party, founded by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale in Oakland in '66, well known for their armed patrols monitoring police.
Yeah.
They also implemented these vital community programs, free breakfast for children, health clinics, clothing drives. It showed a commitment to addressing immediate needs in black communities and challenging systemic inequalities head-on. Their 10-point plan laid out demands for housing, education, and end to police brutality, even reparations.
And inspired by the civil rights movement's successes and strategies, other marginalized groups also began to organize and demand their rights. Native Americans with the Red Power movement and Mexican Americans with the Chicano movement.
The civil rights struggle was definitely a powerful catalyst and a model. The Red Power movement, with groups like the National Indian Youth Council, NIYC, founded in '61, and later the American Indian Movement, AM.
AM became very visible.
They brought national attention to issues facing Native Americans, treaty rights, tribal sovereignty, poverty. They used direct action like the fish-ins in the Pacific Northwest, the occupation of Alcatraz Island starting in '69,
Right, Alcatraz.
and later Wounded Knee in '73. They were demanding the government honor its treaties and address systemic neglect.
And the Chicano movement.
It emerged from the broader Mexican-American civil rights movement. They reclaimed the term Chicano as a term of pride, fought discrimination in schools, jobs, the courts. You had organizations like MAPBA, MELDEF.
And key figures like Cesar Chavez.
Absolutely. Cesar Chavez, organizing farm workers in California with the United Farm Workers, UFW. He used nonviolent tactics inspired by King boycotts, strikes, marches, particularly the Delano grape strike.
And others.
And figures like Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez in Denver with his crusade for justice. He promoted Chicano cultural nationalism, wrote the poem I Am Joaquin, and helped form the La Raza Unida political party.
The feminist movement also experienced a huge resurgence in the 1960s, tackling a whole range of issues: workplace inequality, reproductive rights.
Yes, the second wave of feminism really took off. It built on earlier struggles, but gained new momentum from women's experiences in other movements, like civil rights and anti-war, where they often faced sexism, and just a growing awareness of pervasive gender inequality in basically all aspects of life. Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, published in '63.
Huge impact.
Huge. Articulated the problem that has no name, that sense of dissatisfaction among many, especially suburban housewives. You also had working-class women, welfare mothers forming advocacy groups like the National Welfare Rights Organization.
And the consciousness-raising groups?
Yes, those became really important. Small groups where women shared personal experiences, realizing that the personal is political, connecting individual struggles to larger systemic issues of sexism.
What were the main goals?
Addressing issues like equal pay, job discrimination, access to education and professions, reproductive rights, which became a major focus, later challenging traditional gender roles, demanding things like affordable child care, culminating in events like the Women's Strike for Equality in 1970.
Finally, the modern environmental movement really began to take shape in the 60s too, spurred by growing awareness of ecological threats, and especially Rachel Carson's work.
That's right. There was increasing public awareness of environmental degradation, partly from more people having leisure time to spend in nature, but also seeing the effects of suburban sprawl, industrial pollution.
Yeah.
And then Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring in 1962, was absolutely groundbreaking. It detailed the devastating impact of pesticides, particularly DDT, on ecosystems and potentially human health.
Faced a lot of opposition, didn't it?
Oh, huge opposition from the chemical industry. But her meticulous research and powerful writing really struck a chord. It helped launch the modern environmental movement by highlighting the interconnectedness of ecological and human health.
So this led to more activism.
Yes, a significant rise in environmental consciousness and activism. This era saw the passage of early environmental legislation and really laid the groundwork for the broader movement that exploded in the 70s, marked by the first Earth Day in 1970 and the creation of the EPA.
Even the Catholic Church saw changes.
Yes, the Second Vatican Council, Vatican II, from 62 to 65. It brought significant reforms mass in the vernacular instead of Latin, a greater role for lay people. It caused quite a stir with varying reactions within the church itself.
So as the decade drew to a close, you had the 1969 moon landing, an incredible moment of national unity, technological achievement, fulfilling Kennedy's promise from earlier in the decade.
An amazing achievement, a testament to American ingenuity, a symbolic win in the Cold War space race.
Yet, it seems like it happened against this backdrop of deep societal division and uncertainty.
It really did. It stood in stark contrast to the deep divisions tearing the country apart. Vietnam, ongoing urban unrest, campus protests against the war and social injustices,
Yeah.
the assassinations of King and Robert Kennedy in '68.
Yeah.
That optimistic, forward-thinking spirit of the early 60s had largely given way to a sense of disillusionment, frustration, and a much less certain outlook for the future as the decade ended.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the 1960s, what are the fundamental takeaways? What are the sort of overarching themes that emerge from all these different strands?
Well, the 1960s, as your sources really vividly illustrate, was just a decade of profound, often paradoxical transformation across American society. You can't overstate the change.
Right.
Key themes. Definitely the dismantling of legal segregation through that landmark civil rights legislation, the ambitious, complex, maybe mixed legacy of the Great Society, the deepening and increasingly divisive involvement in Vietnam, and the rise of all these diverse, powerful social movements, challenging established norms, demanding greater rights and equality for everyone.
And looking back through this material, what struck you as particularly insightful or maybe surprising? Any aha moments?
Several things, really. The remarkable courage and, frankly, the effectiveness of nonviolent direct action early on, especially facing such brutal oppression. That's truly inspiring.
Yeah.
The profound and lasting impact of that key legislation, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, despite the continued struggles, it underscores the power of law to reshape society.
Definitely.
The multifaceted motivations behind the counterculture, it wasn't just about rebellion, but this genuine search for alternative ways of living, connecting. That's fascinating.
Okay.
And maybe most significantly, the interconnectedness of all these movements, how the struggle for racial justice really inspired and informed the fights for gender equality, Native American rights, Chicano rights, environmental protection. It reveals this powerful dynamic of social change feeding off itself.
This has been a truly illuminating deep dive into a decade that, well, clearly continues to shape our present.
Absolutely.
And for you, the listener, reflecting on these immense changes and the persistent challenges of the 1960s, what do you see as its most enduring legacy on American society today? How do the issues of that era, the fight for equality, the role of government, the complexities of foreign intervention, questions of identity and rights, how do they continue to resonate in our current times? It's a period that really compels us to consider the ongoing pursuit of a more just and equitable society, a pursuit so powerfully ignited in the turbulent and transformative 1960s.